Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 32nd verse of the 23rd chapter of Luke, and here we read a vivid and poignant description of the crucifixion. And why is the crucifixion so important? Now, the Gospels as a total, about 90% of the material is related, over 90% is related to the 3-year mortal ministry of its protagonist, that being the Messiah. Yet anywhere from a third to a quarter of the account, depending on the account, ranges on the final day of his life. And the final day of his life was not only the most significant for him, but for us, because all that he taught, all that he healed, all that he preached, all the miracles he did were of no truly lasting significance. Now, they are immortalized for posterity in these accounts, but the real benefit of eternal value came from this cross, and it is through the cross that all generations, prior, present, and future, may be spared from the consequences that we merit from our sin. And in that moment in time, he became the sin penalty and assumed the penalty for us sinners, even though he was sinless. And Luke's account, the reason I chose this one is because it features a dialogue with the two other transgressors who the Messiah was accompanied with. Now, any other account makes mention of them, but this actually shows a dialogue, and it's a significant expression of grace. And this event truly marks the turning point from one dispensation to another. And dispensations, you can type in Exodus 21:5. That's one of the only one where I neglected to put my name in front of the title, but it should show up in your YouTube search and you can recognize me. I explain in that dispensation are the rules and regulations governing how divinity relates to humanity for a period of time. And the previous dispensation was the law initiated by Moses, and the dispensation which came after it is grace, or the age of the assembly, which we currently live in now. And now, when he was ministering, they were technically still under the law. So he mentioned as early as the Sermon of the Mount that he came to fulfill the law, but while he lived, the law was not yet fulfilled. And he became the perfect sacrifice, rendering all sacrifices henceforth obsolete. You can learn more about that in Corey Johnston, Hebrews 10:1-18. But really, this expression of grace really marks a turning point, because the moment he died is when the dispensation of grace, or the age of the assembly, or church, was launched. And so we're going to read from the top. Remember, the 32nd verse is where we're starting from. And two others also, evildoers, were led with him to be put to death. Evildoers is translated as malefactors in the King James account. But from the combined descriptions, we understand that these were criminals. Now, the crucifixion was not an ordinary process in criminal justice, according to Roman. Now, a lot of their standards of justice may seem barbaric and antiquated to us, but the fact is that not every criminal was so. It was the death penalty. It was capital punishment. It was reserved exclusively for traitors to the Roman state, and only non-citizens could be subjected to it. So that's what spared Paul he was beheaded according to tradition. And now the Jews had their own form of capital punishment, which was by stoning according to the Mosaic law. And the Romans, they clung to the antiquated superstition of polytheism, whereby each deity represented a geographical terrain or an element, and they were very, very respectful of the nations they conquered, their religious traditions. They had no concept of a universal creator or monotheism, yet they allowed the Jews to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. And they could care less. They were indifferent to the violations of the Mosaic law, in that it represented no threat. So Pilate ultimately, you can read it in the antecedent account to any crucifixion that describes the arrest, indictment, and what Pilate, who has the final say, he was then the ruling governor of the Roman province of Judea. he was reluctant to execute him at all. So it was really a struggle to win him over. And long story short, he gave in to the peer pressure. The mob was clamoring for them. So they wanted him crucified, and that's what he got. And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, they crucified him there, and the evildoers, one on the right and one on the left. Now, Golgotha was the designated area for crucifixions it was on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem. It is alternately known as Calvary Hill, and that is where he paid the price for our sin. So the location is not significant in itself, but it is significant in that what occurred there. And Yahshua said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they divided his garments and cast lots. Now, they clearly had no idea what they were doing, because if they did, they wouldn't do it. Now, it was his claim for deity which subjected him to the Jewish transgression of blasphemy, which was a crime punishable by death in Leviticus 24:16. So they had no idea that they were literally murdering divinity in the flesh. They rejected his claim to be such. Yet he asks for forgiveness, because a sin committed in ignorance is no less grievous to the offender, but it really takes a supernatural strength to call on the forgiveness after being spat on, falsely charged, lied about, and crucified. Crucifixion was the most awful physical punishment that one can endure, but the ultimate pain came when he became sin. So he was separated from his Father, and he cried out, "Father, Father, why have you forsaken me?" I don't know if that's in this account, but that's a reference to Psalm 22:1. And his garments and cast lots was a fulfillment of Psalm 22:18. So he fulfilled prophecy and fulfilled the law by becoming the perfect sacrifice, assuming the place that the innocent animal once filled for those living under the law. And he also fulfilled several prophecies pertaining to the messianic in orientation, and he also fulfilled detailed prophecies such as that one. And the people were standing, looking on, and the rulers also were sneering with them, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah, the chosen of Elohim." So the fact that he was being subjected to such unspeakable pain couldn't cross their mind that he was in fact that the Father would allow his servant to suffer was convincing evidence in their mind that he wasn't what he claimed. And they were sneering. Rulers we understand the term to be Jewish religious authorities, and they're resorting to mockery and ridicule. They, don't kick a man down. They had him there, but they just couldn't resist. And the soldiers were mocking him too, coming and offering him vinegar. Vinegar was because one thirsted. After the average crucifixion ordeal lasted 6 hours, and in that time one would thirst. So they had a stick and had vinegar on one end and handed it to him as a matter of course, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." So this is the Romans speaking. They're essentially repeating a refrain that was in tandem with that of the Jews. And there was also an inscription written over him in letters in Hebrew and Roman, in Greek, in Roman, in Hebrew. "This is the King of the Jews." Now, in English, or in Latin, I believe it's translated, we frequently see R-I-N-I, and that's because R is Rex for king, and I is his name, Yahshua, because there's, in the Latin language, it's spelled with the I. And Nazareth is the N, and I is Judah, the Jews, in the Latin language. And one of the evildoers who were hanged was speaking evil of himself, saying, "If you are the Messiah, save yourself and us." So maybe this wasn't quite as comedic in intent as the ridicules and mockers from the outside looking in, but he's maybe sincerely asking for escape and salvation from this pain. But the other, responding, rebuked him, saying, Do you not even fear Elohim, since you are under the same judgment? So the other, even though subjected to the same unspeakable pain, had a different outlook. He realized that they, unlike him, had merited the offense. Now, it may seem extreme for any crime to merit crucifixion, but he was at least cognizant of his sin, and he was aware that he was paying the just penalty according to the standards of criminal justice at the time. And he didn't ask for deliverance from his temporary pain, but eternal. And we're going to read at that. And we indeed rightly so, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this one has done no wrong. So I ultimately said much of what I would have said in comment before this verse. And he said to Joshua, Master, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So this is curious because the thief is anonymous, so we have no idea what his name was, what his crime was, what his background was. We can assume that he had zero religious, he may have had very little religious ritual in his life, yet he was in the personal presence of divinity in the flesh, and he recognized him for who he was, and instinctively knew, without perhaps having to be told, the nature of the kingdom. And Joshua said to him, Truly, I say to you, you shall be with me in paradise. Now, this is a perplexing concept because the man he wasn't baptized, for instance. He lived a reprobate life, and he's identified as a thief, but we can imagine it was more than petty thief. Remember, crucifixion was reserved for only the most grievous and threatening offenders, traitors of the state, essentially. And yet he seemingly got the reward that many religious people spend their entire lives working for. We're not saved by works. You can work your fingers dry to the bone. That will not save you. We are saved by grace and the recognition that we are sinners and cannot save ourselves. We too have to come like the thief on the cross and ask the Savior for forgiveness at the judgment. And it was now the 6th hour, and darkness came over all the land until the 9th hour. So 6th hour was noon. That was the midday, midpoint. So the presence of darkness is unusual for this period of time. And that was sufficient proof that it was as if creation groaned in response to the crucifixion of its creator. So that was convincing testimony of his divinity. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. So the temple, there were 3 main areas. There was the gathering place open to the public and Gentiles. Then there was the most sacred place, which was reserved exclusively for the trained priest. And then the most sacred of sacred, from which the sacred place was separated from by a curtain, whereby the high priest had the exclusive prerogative of approaching divinity once a year on Yom Kippur, their most significant holiday. But the access point, the symbolism is significant because henceforth the access point, there was no longer any necessary function for the priest to serve. The priest acted in an intermediate capacity between divinity and man. But here we have a perfect priest performing a perfect sacrifice. So he's fulfilling both roles, and henceforth, divinity is never more than a prayer away. We can come as we are and not worry about having to change ourselves before coming, because the change will come when we are humble enough to recognize our imperfections. And crying out with a loud voice, Joshua said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. And the centurion, seeing what took place, praised Elohim, saying, Truly, this man was righteous. Now, in alternate accounts, we have him recorded as saying, Truly, this was the son of Elohim. But it's an expression of his character. Now, that was not an ordinary procedure. It was, in fact, miraculous. And the centurion was cognizant enough of the unusualness of this darkness coming. Now, he couldn't have seen the temple, but he had the supernatural portent in the color of the sky. It's noon and it's dark. So he was convinced of his divinity. And now, if I may close on the note of the thief, we don't know who he was, we don't know what he did, we don't know how much religious education, training, or experience he had, but he brought nothing to the cross and he left with everything. So if you haven't been to the cross, a lot of people mistake what that means. It's not a literal cross, it's or a metaphorical one even. It's to come to the cross in faith. Come as you are, never leave the same. And that concludes today's message. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.